The Appalachian Mountains are ancient, older than the bones of the earth itself. Their ridges hold secrets buried beneath centuries of silence. The mist rolls in like a living thing, whispering in the voices of those long forgotten. The locals know better than to stray too far after dark. They speak in hushed tones of the Hollow Ones, shadows that move without sound, figures that watch from the treeline but never step forward. Ethan Graves, a journalist from New York, never believed in ghost stories. He chased facts, not folklore. When he was assigned to investigate the mysterious disappearances in Black Hollow, a nearly abandoned Appalachian town, he expected nothing more than an urban legend blown out of proportion. But Black Hollow wasn't just a town. It was a warning, and by the time Ethan realized it, it was already too late. The town that vanished. The Appalachian Mountains were as old as the world itself, their craggy ridges and mist-filled valleys holding secrets that no one dared to uncover. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the mountain's darkness, how the fog rolled in at night, thick and suffocating, as if it were alive. They warned visitors not to venture too far, especially after dark. The deep, wooded hollows were home to more than just animals. They were home to something older, something that no one fully understood. Ethan Graves, a journalist from New York, never put stock in old ghost stories or local legends. He believed in facts, not folklore. He was the kind of man who chased the truth with a sharp mind and a critical eye, refusing to give in to the allure of superstition. When he was assigned to investigate a series of mysterious disappearances in Black Hollow, a nearly forgotten Appalachian town, he saw it as just another assignment, a story that would make a good headline and then fade into obscurity, like so many others before it. But Black Hollow was different. It wasn't just a town, it was something far darker, something waiting. As Ethan's car rumbled up the narrow mountain road toward the town, the weather began to shift. The sun, which had been hanging low in the sky, seemed to disappear behind a thick layer of clouds. The temperature dropped, and an unsettling stillness filled the air. The trees, tall and ancient, stood silent, their branches heavy with mist. The further Ethan drove, the heavier the atmosphere became, as if the very mountains were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. His GPS had long since lost its signal, and the only thing that guided him now were the narrow signs marking the route to Black Hollow. But even the signs began to seem strange, weathered and worn, their edges frayed as if they'd been there for a century. Ethan thought little of it. It was just an old town, a forgotten place where time had left its mark. He turned a corner and found himself staring at the edge of the town. Black Hollow wasn't much more than a few crumbling houses and an old general store, its windows dark and empty. The buildings seemed abandoned, as if the entire town had been swallowed by the mountain itself. The only sign of life was the faint light flickering in the window of the general store. Ethan pulled his car to a stop and stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked toward the building. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the air inside stale and thick with the smell of old wood and dust. The inside of the store was dimly lit, the shelves lined with ancient cans and jars, their labels faded and unreadable. Behind the counter stood an old man, his face hidden in shadow, his eyes sharp and cold. "You must be Ethan Graves," the man said, his voice gravelly. "I've been expecting you." Ethan wasn't surprised. The story of the disappearances had drawn attention from the press, but the man's tone made him feel uneasy. "Yes, I'm here to investigate the recent disappearances," Ethan said, trying to sound confident. "What can you tell me about them?" The old man's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, his fingers tapping on the counter. "There's something about this place that doesn't sit right with people. People come, and then they vanish just like that. But no one talks about it. No one asks questions. They know better than to dig too deep." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? You're saying these people just disappeared?" The man nodded slowly, his eyes flickering toward the window, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "Not just disappeared. They were taken. By something that lives in the mountain. The Hollow Ones." Ethan chuckled, though the sound came out dry. "The Hollow Ones? Is that what you're calling them? A ghost story?" The old man's face grew serious. "You don't believe in them now, but you will when you see them. They aren't just stories, boy. They're real. And they're watching you." Ethan didn't know what to make of the old man's words. He had heard enough urban legends and ghost stories in his time to know that people often let their imaginations run wild. But the look in the man's eyes, the way he spoke, made Ethan pause. There was something about him, something that made the air feel thicker, more suffocating. He didn't say anything more. He simply turned and walked out of the store, feeling the eyes of the old man boring into his back. As he stepped back into his car, he glanced over at the empty streets of Black Hollow. The town felt lifeless, as if it had been abandoned long ago. But something about it seemed wrong. The silence was too deep, the fog too thick. Ethan started his car and drove further into the town. The further he went, the darker it seemed. The houses loomed like decaying skeletons, their windows shattered or boarded up. The trees closed in on either side of the road, their twisted limbs reaching out like hands trying to pull him into the woods. A sense of unease settled in his stomach, but he brushed it off. It was just a small town with a history of strange events. He had been sent to get the facts, not to be scared. He drove until he reached the edge of town, where the road disappeared into the thick forest. He parked the car and got out, standing at the edge of the forest, staring into the darkness beyond. There was something unnatural about the way the trees stood, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their branches stretched out like long fingers, beckoning him closer. Ethan took a deep breath and began walking into the woods. The fog rolled in around him, clinging to his clothes and making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his footsteps crunching on the dead leaves beneath his boots. The air felt cold and damp, but there was something else, a strange, oppressive heaviness, as if the forest itself was alive watching him. He walked deeper, the trees closing in around him, until he came to a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old, decaying cabin, its windows dark and empty. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, as if it hadn't been opened in years. Ethan approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. Something about the cabin called to him, as if it were meant for him to find. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the floor creaked under his weight. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the dim rays of sunlight that managed to filter through the cracks in the walls. In the center of the room was an old wooden chair, its legs crooked and worn, facing a cracked mirror on the far wall. Ethan walked toward the mirror, his breath catching in his throat as he gazed into it. The reflection was distorted, the edges of the mirror warped as if it had been cracked by something powerful. But it wasn't just the mirror that caught his attention. It was what he saw in the reflection, his own face, but different. His eyes were dark, hollow, as if something had drained the life out of him. His skin looked pale, his features sharp and unnatural. He stumbled back, his heart racing. The room was silent again, but the air felt heavier than before, thick with an unseen presence. Suddenly, the mirror began to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen hand. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he reached for the door, but before he could move, the room went cold. The air grew so dense it felt like it was pressing against his chest. He turned to run, but his legs refused to move. And then, from the depths of the shadows, a whispering voice echoed in his mind. "Welcome to Black Hollow. The fog that whispers." Ethan awoke with a start, the oppressive weight of the night still pressing down on him. His head ached, and his throat felt dry, as if he hadn't spoken a word in days. He could still hear the whisper from the dark, the words echoing in his mind as though they had been carved there by some unseen hand. "Welcome to Black Hollow." He sat up, his hands gripping the edge of the old chair, and looked around the decaying cabin. His breath fogged in the chill air, but it wasn't just the temperature that made him shiver. It was the feeling that something was watching him. The fog outside seemed thicker now, creeping in through the cracks in the walls, wrapping around his feet like tendrils, and he realized with a jolt that the door to the cabin was no longer where he had left it. There was no exit. It had vanished. A low hum filled the air, a sound not of the forest, but of something ancient, something that had been waiting. Ethan stood, his mind racing. He had to get out, to find the truth, but as he moved to the center of the room, he felt his body hesitate. Something wasn't right. The air was too still, too heavy, as though every corner of the room had eyes upon him. He stepped forward cautiously, every nerve in his body on high alert. The fog swirled around his feet, thick and impenetrable, as if the ground itself was shifting. The walls seemed to close in on him, the cabin's beams creaking under the weight of its age. There was no noise. No birds, no wind, not even the usual hum of nature that one would expect in such a place. The fog had silenced everything, made it feel wrong. Just as he reached for the door frame, he stopped. His eyes flickered to the cracked mirror that had drawn his attention earlier. It was no longer reflecting his face, but something else. It was a shadow, a figure standing behind him, unmoving. It was tall, and its outline was faint, but there was something about it that made Ethan's heart race. He spun around, his pulse pounding in his ears, but there was nothing behind him. Nothing but the dense, swirling fog that seemed to press against the walls like a living thing. He stared at the mirror again, and this time, he didn't see just one shadow, but dozens. They flickered in and out of sight, like half-formed figures emerging from the mist. The whisper came again, clearer this time, as if it was speaking directly to him. "Leave now while you still can." Ethan took a step back, his mind spinning. He couldn't understand what was happening. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. His logical mind, the one that had driven him through his career as a journalist, screamed at him to focus, to analyze. There had to be an explanation, something rational. But deep inside, something primal, something ancient was tugging at him, telling him that he was far beyond reason now. His eyes darted to the window, where the fog had thickened further, the trees outside becoming blurred shadows. He had to leave, to get away from the cabin. Whatever was happening here, whatever haunted this town, it was not something he could simply write off as a ghost story. It was real, and it was coming for him. He forced himself to move, pushing through the door and into the fog. The air outside was colder than he had expected, the chill sinking into his bones. As he stepped forward, his feet sank into the ground, the mist wrapping around his legs like cold fingers. He looked around, but all he could see was the darkened forest, the trees now looming over him like silent sentinels. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to steady himself. The oppressive silence was overwhelming, but even worse was the feeling that the fog was watching him, waiting for him to make a wrong move. Every step felt like it was taking him deeper into something he couldn't escape. The road that had once led him into Black Hollow was now completely obscured by the fog, and as he walked further, the trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. There was no sign of life, no indication that anyone else was around. The town was empty, and the only thing that existed now was him and the mist. And then, in the distance, a faint light flickered. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. There was someone else out here. It had to be. He moved toward the light, his feet quickening as the fog seemed to lift slightly, just enough to allow him to see the outline of a building. It was a small house, its windows dark and its door ajar. The light came from inside, faint but steady, like a beacon calling to him. He approached the house cautiously, his eyes scanning the surroundings. No sound, no movement. It was as though the world had stopped, holding its breath, waiting for him to step inside. As he reached the doorway, he hesitated. He knew he was being drawn into something, into a place he had no business being. The town, the fog, the whispering voice, it was all part of the same thing, the same darkness. But what choice did he have? He couldn't go back into the woods. He couldn't run anymore. With a deep breath, Ethan stepped into the house. Inside, the air was warmer, though still thick with the scent of age and decay. The walls were lined with old photographs, their edges yellowed with time. The room was dimly lit, with candles burning in the corners, their flames flickering unnaturally in the stale air. In the center of the room sat a woman, her back to him, her face hidden in shadow. She was still, unmoving, and yet there was something unsettling about her presence. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, his instincts screaming at him to turn and leave, but his feet refused to move. The silence was broken only by the faint rustling of the woman's dress, the only sign of life in the room. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "You shouldn't have come here." Ethan's throat tightened as he forced himself to speak. "What is this place? What's happening in Black Hollow?" The woman turned slowly, her face pale and drawn, eyes hollow with an emptiness that seemed to stretch forever. "This is the place where the lost are kept. The Hollow Ones. You've seen them, haven't you?" Ethan nodded, unable to speak. His mind was reeling, trying to process everything that had happened since he arrived. The shadows, the whispering fog, the sense of being watched, it was all too much, too surreal. "The Hollow Ones," she continued, "are the ones who have been taken, just like you will be. They were once like you, curious, brave, but now they're part of this place. Part of the mountain." Her words sent a chill down his spine. Taken. Ethan's heart raced, his thoughts a blur. He had to get out. He had to get away from this woman, from the darkness that seemed to be closing in on him. But before he could move, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him in the room. The woman's eyes locked onto his, a cold smile creeping across her face. "You can't leave," she whispered, her voice now echoing in his mind. "You belong to the mountain now." And as the room began to spin, as the darkness crept in from all sides, Ethan realized with a sickening certainty that Black Hollow had no intention of letting him go. The Hollow Ones. Ethan's body jerked violently as the darkness overwhelmed him, the room spinning around him faster than his mind could process. He struggled to breathe, to make sense of the woman's cryptic words, but it was as though the air itself had thickened, pressing down on him, squeezing him into submission. His vision blurred, and his legs buckled beneath him as the world around him shifted. He fell to the floor, his hands clutching the cold, dusty wood. His heart raced in his chest, and he gasped for breath, but no matter how much he tried, the air felt too thick, too heavy to inhale properly. He tried to stand, but his legs didn't obey. Panic gripped him, but there was no escape. No door. No window. Only the woman and the shadows in the corners of the room. The woman's smile never wavered. She stood tall, watching him with an eerie calmness as he struggled. "You can't fight it, Ethan," she said, her voice soft, almost soothing. "The Hollow Ones have already claimed you." The words hit him like a physical blow. Hollow Ones. He had heard whispers of them in the town, the people who had vanished without a trace. People who went into the mountains and never returned. Some said they had been taken by the forest itself. Others claimed the spirits of the mountain were hungry for souls. But now, as he lay helpless on the floor, surrounded by shadows, Ethan knew that whatever these Hollow Ones were, they were not just stories. They were real, and they were coming for him. He could feel it now, that presence, the cold fingers of the fog creeping into his chest, wrapping around his heart, squeezing it tight. The woman stepped forward, her face still pale, her eyes now glowing with an unnatural light. She knelt beside him, her face mere inches from his. "You don't understand, do you?" she whispered, her voice a haunting lullaby. "This place is alive. It's been waiting for someone like you to stumble in, someone with a connection to the outside world, someone who would dig too deep." Ethan tried to force himself to speak, but his throat was dry, as if the very air had stolen his voice. He could barely move, his limbs feeling like they were made of lead. All he could do was stare into her hollow eyes, feeling the weight of her words sink deeper into him, as if they were burrowing into his soul. The woman leaned closer, her breath cold against his ear. "The Hollow Ones are the ones who didn't listen. They didn't heed the warnings, didn't leave when they should have. And now they're part of the mountain. They walk in the fog, in the shadows, waiting for those like you to wander too far." Ethan could hear the faint rustling of fabric behind him, the soft shuffle of footsteps, and he knew without turning around that he was not alone. There were more. The Hollow Ones were real, and they were here, closing in on him. The shadows in the room began to shift, to move. They were no longer just dark corners. They were shapes, figures with distorted limbs, faces obscured by the fog, but their eyes were unmistakable. Empty. Hollow. He turned his head to the side, trying to force himself up, but his muscles refused to cooperate. He could barely make out the figures, their forms indistinct but terrifying all the same. They stood just out of reach, watching him, waiting. "Leave me alone." Ethan gasped, his voice barely a whisper, but it was enough to make the figures stir. They shifted forward, slow at first, but with each passing second, their movements became more pronounced, more deliberate. The woman's smile widened, her teeth too white, too sharp. "You think you can escape? You think the fog, the mountain, the Hollow Ones will just let you go?" She let out a low, unsettling laugh, and Ethan felt the floor beneath him begin to tremble, as if the earth itself was alive, shifting beneath the weight of their presence. "You belong to Black Hollow now," she continued, her voice cold as ice. "You always have. We've been waiting for you, Ethan. Waiting for someone to come, someone who could understand. You see, we're all part of this place now. The Hollow Ones are trapped here. Trapped in the fog, in the shadows. But not all of us are content with our fate." Her words hung in the air, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What did she mean by that? What was she trying to tell him? Suddenly, the fog in the room thickened, swirling violently as if it had come alive. The shadows crept closer, their eyes gleaming from the darkness. The woman stood up, moving away from him, and in that moment, the truth hit him like a punch to the gut. They weren't just watching him. They were waiting for him to become one of them. The Hollow Ones. Once people like him. Once individuals who had walked the earth, laughed, cried, lived their lives. And now they were nothing more than shadows, whispers in the fog, lost souls cursed to wander the mountain forever. Ethan's vision blurred, the fog encroaching on his mind, seeping into his thoughts, suffocating his will to resist. His eyes locked onto the figures. Somewhere among them, there were faces he recognized. Faces of people who had come before him. The missing townspeople. The ones who had disappeared without a trace. But now they were different. Hollowed out. Empty. The woman turned back to him, her expression almost sympathetic, though there was no warmth in her eyes. You're already starting to understand. You feel it, don't you? The pull of the mountain. The hunger. You belong to it now, just like the rest of us. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. His body was numb, his mind slipping away from him, as though something was draining him, pulling him into the fog. It was happening. He was becoming one of them. The hollow ones were not just shadows, not just lost souls. They were the mountain's curse, and the mountain had claimed him as its next prisoner. The woman took a step back, her eyes gleaming with the cold light of the fog. You will join us, Ethan. It's inevitable. And as the last of his strength drained away, Ethan could feel himself slipping. His vision went dark as the hollow ones closed in, their faces twisted in silent screams, their hollow eyes fixed on him. The fog swallowed him whole, and he knew then, with a horrifying clarity, that Black Hollow was more than just a place. It was a prison, and it had claimed another soul. The forgotten souls. The last thing Ethan remembered was the chilling fog, the oppressive weight of the shadows closing in on him. His senses felt muted, as though the world around him had been reduced to nothing but a whispering memory. The mountain had swallowed him whole, and now he was part of it, his very soul torn away and scattered among the forgotten. He couldn't remember how long he had been there. Minutes? Hours? Days? Time had become irrelevant, lost in the fog of Black Hollow. When he finally came to, the first thing he noticed was the smell. It was thick, damp and decaying, like something long forgotten. His head was pounding, his body heavy, as though it had been dragged through the earth itself. His hands trembled as he reached for his surroundings. The ground beneath him was cold, hard stone, and there was an eerie stillness that seemed to hang in the air. He opened his eyes, blinking against the dim light that filtered through the thick mist. The world around him was distorted, not quite real. The shadows loomed like twisted figures in the distance, always watching, always waiting. He wasn't alone. As his mind slowly began to piece together what had happened, a horrifying realization crept over him. He was no longer in the room where he had been, no longer even in the cabin. He was somewhere deeper now, somewhere in the heart of Black Hollow. The mountain had claimed him, and now he was part of its nightmare. There were other figures around him, all standing motionless, their faces obscured by the fog. Their forms were like silhouettes, indistinct and yet full of malevolent intent. Ethan could feel their eyes on him, boring into him, empty and soulless. They were the hollow ones, the souls who had come before him, the ones who had lost themselves to the mountain's curse. One of them stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the figure came into the dim light, revealing the face of a man who looked almost human, but there was something wrong. His eyes were hollow, dark pits where no light could shine, and his skin was a sickly gray, like a corpse that had been left to rot. His mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too perfect. Ethan backed away instinctively, his breath catching in his throat. Who are you?" he gasped, his voice barely a whisper, lost in the oppressive silence of the fog. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it tilted its head to the side, as if studying him, weighing his worth. Ethan could feel the cold dread in the air, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. He was trapped, but he didn't know how to escape. There was no way out, not now, not with the mountain closing in on him. The figure finally spoke, its voice low and raspy, like the sound of wind through dry leaves. "You're one of us now," it said, its words carrying the weight of centuries. "You've joined the forgotten, just like the others." Ethan felt his stomach churn at the words. The forgotten. That was what they were. The souls who had been taken by the mountain, claimed by its insatiable hunger. The ones who had walked too far, asked too many questions. The ones who hadn't heeded the warnings. The figure took a step closer, its hollow eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "You think you can fight it? You think you can escape?" it rasped. "There is no escape, no salvation. The hollow ones are the mountain's eternal prisoners. We are its servants, its children. And now you will be too." Ethan's mind spun as he tried to make sense of it all. He wasn't like them. He couldn't be. He was just a man, a journalist, doing his job. He had come to Black Hollow to uncover a story, but now he had become part of the legend, part of the curse. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The figure reached out, its cold hand brushing against Ethan's shoulder. The touch sent a jolt of icy terror through him, and for the first time since his arrival in Black Hollow, he understood. This wasn't just a curse. It was something far worse. It was a transformation, a slow and painful process of becoming something else, something less than human. The Hollow Ones weren't just souls trapped in the mountain. They were its extensions, its vessels, and Ethan was on the brink of becoming one of them. A distant scream echoed through the fog, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Ethan's heart raced as he turned toward the noise, but the fog was too thick, the shadows too deep. There was no telling where it had come from, or who had made it. The figure that stood before him spoke again, its voice filled with something that could have been pity or malice, or perhaps both. You can't escape it. You will never leave Black Hollow. You are here now forever. Ethan shook his head violently, refusing to accept what the figure was saying. No, I won't stay here. I'll find a way out. His voice trailed off as the figure raised a hand, cutting him off. You think the fog will let you leave? The figure asked, its tone mocking. You think the Hollow Ones will let you leave? They are always watching, always waiting. You are already part of us. You belong to the mountain now. And soon you will forget everything about who you were. You will become one of us. Ethan staggered back, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the figure's words sank in. He could feel it, the weight of the curse pressing down on him, taking hold of his mind, his body, his soul. The Hollow Ones weren't just spirits. They were the manifestation of the mountain's hunger, a hunger that would never be satisfied. And he was about to be devoured by it. A terrible, aching sadness washed over him, the realization that he would never escape, never see the outside world again. He was lost to the mountain, just another soul trapped in its endless void. The Hollow Ones were not just a warning, they were a fate, and it was now his fate too. As the figure began to fade back into the fog, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts, the distant screams continued, echoing in the emptiness. And in that moment, Ethan knew with sickening certainty that the mountain had no mercy. The final silence. The fog had thickened to a near-impenetrable veil, and with every passing moment, Ethan felt himself sinking deeper into the curse of Black Hollow. His pulse hammered in his ears, a frantic rhythm against the dead silence of the mountain. It was as though time had slowed, or perhaps had ceased to exist altogether. His thoughts were clouded, his mind heavy with the overwhelming sense of despair that seemed to pulse in the very air around him. The Hollow Ones had retreated, vanishing into the fog, but their presence lingered, pressing in on him like a vice. The fear, the terror, the hopelessness, it had all settled into his bones. He had seen their faces, those twisted, hollow eyes, the mouths that didn't speak but still carried their message. He had been warned. There was no escape, no way out. Yet the instinct to survive, to fight, still clung to him, however feebly. Ethan stumbled through the fog, his hands reaching out in front of him, trying to steady himself, trying to make sense of his surroundings. But all he could see was the mist, swirling and shifting, a blur of gray and white that seemed to close in tighter with each step. The silence was deafening, oppressive. He couldn't even hear his own breathing, only the distant, echoing cries from somewhere deep within the hollow. Then he saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the mist, its form barely visible, almost indistinct. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he thought he might be hallucinating. But the figure did not move. It was like a shadow, unmoving, a part of the fog itself. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice hoarse and barely audible. He felt his throat constrict as he spoke, the words escaping him like a desperate plea. But the figure did not respond. It simply stood there, watching. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his fear warring with his need for answers. He took a cautious step forward, his feet dragging through the heavy mist. As he got closer, the figure's features slowly became clearer, but they still held an eerie, unearthly quality. It was a woman, or what had once been a woman. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those hollow eyes, were like black voids pulling him in. Her hair hung in tangled clumps around her face, but there was no emotion in her expression, no life. She didn't speak, but Ethan felt a sudden compulsion to approach her. It was as though the fog itself was urging him forward, drawing him toward her. He could feel his body moving against his will, his legs carrying him despite the panic that surged within him. The woman's presence was magnetic, as if the mountain had summoned her to guide him deeper into its dark heart. When he was only a few feet away from her, she lifted her hand. Ethan froze. There was something wrong, something terribly wrong. Her fingers were too long, too thin, and they seemed to stretch impossibly as she beckoned him closer. The silence in the air thickened, suffocating him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he reached out, his hand shaking, his heart pounding. As his fingers brushed against hers, a jolt of ice shot through his body, and the world around him seemed to shatter. The mountain, the fog, the hollow ones, they all merged into one overwhelming presence. The woman's face twisted, her hollow eyes gleaming with malice, and then everything went black. When Ethan opened his eyes again, he wasn't sure where he was. He wasn't sure if he was still alive. The mist had lifted. The fog that had once surrounded him had cleared, leaving him in a strange and unfamiliar place. The ground beneath him felt different, softer, almost warm, but it was the sky that caught his attention. It wasn't the sky he knew. It was dark, unnaturally dark, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart. He stood up slowly, his body trembling. The world around him seemed wrong, as if he were trapped in some twisted dream, a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. The air felt dense, heavier than it had ever been before. His senses were muddled, as though his mind was struggling to grasp onto something, anything that would make sense. But there was nothing. Ethan could feel it then, the pull. The same compulsion that had drawn him to the woman, that had dragged him into this world, was now pulling at him again, urging him to go deeper. He tried to fight it, but it was too strong, too overwhelming. Every step he took felt like a step into the void, a step into the unknown, where the laws of reality no longer applied. It wasn't long before he realized the truth. This wasn't the world he had known. This wasn't Black Hollow, not in the way he had understood it. This was something far worse, something beyond the mountain, beyond the fog, beyond even death itself. He was trapped. Trapped in a place where the hollow ones were not merely spirits. They were the very essence of the land, the mountain, the curse. And now Ethan was one of them. He had become part of the land's insatiable hunger. He turned around, and the woman was there, standing silently in the distance, her hollow eyes locked on him. There were no words, no explanation. She was the gatekeeper, the guide, and now, so was he. There was no escape. The last remnants of Ethan's humanity, the journalist, the man who had come seeking answers, faded away, swallowed by the darkness of Black Hollow. He was now another soul lost to the mountain, just another forgotten one, waiting in the fog for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too far. And the cycle would continue. The mountain was patient, as ancient as time itself. It would wait, and it would claim more. Forever. The forgotten peak, whispers in the snow. The wind howled through the mountain pass, carrying an eerie chill that seeped into the bones. The snow-covered slopes of Black Peak stood tall and unforgiving, their jagged edges lost in a sky thick with swirling mist. The mountain was ancient, untouched by time, yet it carried an unsettling presence, something unseen, something forgotten. USA, a seasoned trekker and adventure blogger, adjusted the straps of his backpack. The thrill of an unexplored path always excited him, but this journey was different. Black Peak was more than just a challenge. It was a place wrapped in myth, avoided even by the most experienced climbers. Accompanying him were his 4 closest friends. Zane, the group's survival expert, always calm and observant. Daniel, the enthusiastic documentarian, capturing every step on his camera. Mira, the researcher, obsessed with history and local folklore. Sophie, the group's medic, practical but deeply intuitive. They had all heard the stories, the warnings from the villagers. That mountain is cursed, an old man had told them in a hushed voice, his eyes filled with fear. Turn back before it's too late. USA had dismissed the warning with a smile. Legends and ghost stories couldn't stop him now. The ascent begins. The climb was treacherous. The snow beneath their boots crunched loudly, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. The cold was harsher than they had anticipated, and the wind carried strange echoes, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. I swear I just heard something, Sophie muttered, pulling her jacket tighter. The wind plays tricks up here, Mira assured her, though her own voice lacked confidence. They pressed on. The path was barely visible under the thick snow, but USA's map, an old, faded sketch he had found in a forgotten archive, indicated that an abandoned village lay ahead. A village lost to time. Something watches. Hours passed. The higher they climbed, the heavier the air became. Shadows flickered within the mist, moving strangely, as if something unseen lurked just beyond their vision. Something feels off, Zane said suddenly, his sharp instincts sensing the change before anyone else. USA was about to dismiss his concern when Daniel gasped. Look, Ahead of them, barely visible through the thick snowfall, stood a forgotten village. Half buried in ice, the wooden houses leaned at odd angles, their roofs collapsed, windows shattered. Some doors were slightly open, creaking softly in the wind, as if someone had just slipped inside. "This place isn't on any modern map," Sophie whispered. USA approached cautiously, brushing snow off a wooden signpost at the village entrance. The ancient letters were barely readable, but the message sent a chill down his spine. "Do not disturb the silence. Do not wake the ones who sleep." Then, from somewhere deep within the village, a distant scream shattered the silence. It wasn't the wind. Something was waiting. The Village of Silence. The scream echoed through the snow-covered village, a cry filled with so much terror that it seemed to freeze the very air around them. USA's heart raced as he stood motionless, his mind racing with thoughts of what could have caused that sound. It was not an animal. It was far too human, too desperate. "Did anyone else hear that?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His camera, still hanging around his neck, felt heavier now. "Yes," Zane said, his voice low, his eyes scanning the village. And it didn't sound like the wind. That was someone or something. Myra's face had drained of color. She had always been the rational one, the skeptic, but this was different. "We need to leave," Sophie said, her voice tense. "This place isn't right." But USA wasn't listening. The pull of the unknown, the lure of what was hidden in this forgotten village, was too strong. "We're here now. We should at least take a look around. It could be an old trail marker or something else, just an echo. Nothing more." His words seemed to hang in the air, but even he didn't fully believe them. There was something unsettling about this place, something that tugged at the edges of his consciousness. Still, his curiosity overpowered the growing dread that threatened to consume him. With a deep breath, USA took the first step towards the village. The others hesitated but followed. The snow crunched beneath their feet, an unnatural sound in the silence that surrounded them. The village's eyes. As they stepped deeper into the village, the darkness seemed to grow thicker. The fog swirling around them felt almost alive, wrapping around their bodies like a cold embrace. The houses, long abandoned, stood like decaying sentinels, their windows empty, their doors creaking in the wind. They passed what seemed to be the remnants of a town square, the center stone cracked and worn. Yet something about the place felt too preserved, as though the village had only just been left behind. There were no signs of wildlife, no birds, no animals, nothing to break the eerie silence. Mira stopped in her tracks, looking at the walls of one of the houses. Strange markings were carved into the wood, symbols that looked almost like a form of writing. "These don't look like anything I've ever seen," she said, tracing the symbols with her finger. "They look ancient, like some sort of warning." Zane turned toward the center of the village. "I don't like this. Let's just get to the other side and leave." But USA was already moving forward, drawn by the pull of the unknown. As they continued, the village seemed to stretch before them, endless and unchanged by time. They came to a stop in front of a larger building, an old church, or at least what had once been a church. The wooden doors stood ajar, and the faintest flicker of light could be seen through the cracks. USA, feeling an unexplainable compulsion, pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, and the moment it opened fully, a sharp gust of wind swept through, extinguishing their flashlights. They stood in darkness for a moment, breath held, before USA pulled out a small lighter and flicked it on. The unseen presence. Inside, the air was thick, musty, and cold. The walls were lined with old, rotting pews, and at the front of the room stood a stone altar. Blood-red stains marred the stone, evidence of something dark that had happened long ago. The smell of decay was overwhelming, and USA couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His lighter flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the room, distorting the strange symbols carved into the stone walls. As he moved toward the altar, his heart began to race. A feeling of dread settled over him. It was as though something ancient, something malevolent, was alive in this place. Then a sound. A soft whisper, barely audible, came from the darkness at the back of the church. USA's breath caught in his throat. He turned to his friends. "Did you hear that?" The others nodded, fear written on their faces. They had all heard it, a faint, soft voice, as if calling them from the shadows. It came again, clearer this time, a voice like a hiss, barely more than a whisper. "Leave this place, or it will consume you." The whisper faded as quickly as it had come, but its echo lingered in the cold air. I think we need to go, Mira said, her voice shaking. This place is cursed. But USA stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the altar. Something was drawing him in, some invisible force that he couldn't explain. USA, please, Sophie pleaded, her voice cracking. Let's go. But it was too late. The curse awakens. Without warning, the ground beneath their feet trembled. The walls seemed to pulse, as though the very village was alive. A deep rumble echoed from beneath the altar, followed by a low, guttural growl. The whispers grew louder, now voices of agony, of pain, and of something far darker. The temperature in the room dropped, their breath visible in the freezing air. Then, the altar began to crack, as though something beneath it was struggling to break free. Suddenly, the doors slammed shut, trapping them inside. The room was plunged into complete darkness. The awakening. The darkness swallowed them whole, thick and suffocating. USA's lighter flickered out, leaving them in an eerie, oppressive blackness. Panic surged in his chest, and he instinctively reached out to his friends, his hands brushing against cold, trembling bodies. Sophie. Mira. Zane, he called, his voice tight with fear, but the only response was the distant, hollow sound of his own voice bouncing off the stone walls. Then the growl came again, a deep, unnatural rumble from beneath the altar. The air grew heavier, more oppressive, like a weight pressing down on their chests. Zane, who had been standing in silence, suddenly shouted, "We need to get out now." His voice cracked, his usual calm demeanor completely shattered. "What's happening?" Daniel's voice was shaky, his camera still clutched in his hands, though the lens was useless in the dark. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath them trembled violently, and the entire church seemed to shudder, as though the very building was alive. A low, bone-chilling sound emerged from the floor, the scraping of something ancient, moving beneath the stone. The walls seemed to warp, shifting and bending as if they were breathing, pulling them closer to something sinister. Then, in the midst of the chaos, a flash of red illuminated the room. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, USA saw a figure, faint but unmistakable, hovering in the darkness. It was a shape tall and slender, draped in tattered robes, its face obscured by a shadow. The figure stood in the farthest corner, motionless. "Did anyone see that?" Mira gasped. Her voice trembled, barely above a whisper. But before anyone could respond, the altar cracked open with a deafening sound, and a terrible force pushed them backward. USA felt the floor give way beneath him, and he was thrown to the ground as a dark entity emerged from the broken altar. The figure was enormous, its form shifting, undulating, as though made of shadow and smoke. Its eyes glowed a haunting red, burning with an ancient, unholy fire. It let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that sent ice through USA's veins. "Run!" Zane screamed, his voice full of terror. But there was no escape. The doors were locked, and the windows were sealed shut. The only way out was past the entity that now filled the room with its suffocating presence. The entity stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring their fear. The air grew colder, sharper, and every breath felt like it was tearing at their lungs. USA could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the adrenaline pumping, but his legs refused to move. "What do you want from us?" USA shouted, though his voice quivered with fear. The entity did not respond, but its eyes gleamed brighter, the red intensifying, as if it fed on his fear. Then, with a sudden movement, it reached out. Its hands were long, skeletal, with sharp, claw-like fingers. In an instant, it was standing before USA, its cold breath washing over him. He felt his body freeze, his mind gripped by a sense of doom he couldn't shake. It was as though the very essence of his soul was being drawn into the entity, as if it wanted to claim him, consume him. We need to destroy it," Mira cried, her voice filled with panic. Zane, always the level-headed one, turned to USA. "Do you have anything? Any way to fight this thing?" USA's mind raced. He had no weapons, no way to fight the creature, but something in the back of his mind, some ancient warning or forgotten memory, urged him to act. "The altar," USA whispered. "It must be tied to the entity. We have to destroy it." With all the strength he could muster, USA pushed himself up, signaling to his friends to follow. The entity was still focused on him, its red eyes burning with malice, but as he staggered toward the altar, it hesitated, its form flickering like smoke. "Hurry!" Sophie shouted, her voice strained. Together, they reached the altar, where USA pulled at the cracked stone, desperate to find a way to destroy whatever held the creature's power. The growl from the entity grew louder, more menacing, but USA's focus remained on the altar. Finally, with one last push, the stone cracked open further, revealing an ancient book, its pages darkened by age, the cover etched with symbols identical to those in the village. The moment USA touched it, the room seemed to freeze, and a sudden clarity washed over him. "This is it," he shouted, flipping the book open. The pages seemed to hum with a dark energy, the ink shifting as if alive. As USA read the first line aloud, a wave of light erupted from the book, blasting the entity backward. It howled in agony, its red eyes dimming, its form flickering. But the battle wasn't over. The entity writhed, its form twisting violently as it fought against the power of the book. The air around them crackled with dark energy, and the village seemed to groan beneath the weight of the struggle. The final confrontation. The light from the book flickered erratically, its glow pulsing as if it were alive, fighting to stay lit in the face of an overwhelming darkness. USA's heart pounded in his chest, every beat syncing with the tremors that shook the ground beneath their feet. The entity shrieked, a horrific sound that reverberated through the walls of the church, making the very air vibrate with malevolent energy. "We can't hold it off forever," Zane shouted, his voice strained. He was pushing against the altar, trying to keep the entity from getting any closer, but the air was thick with tension. It felt as though the very village itself was closing in on them. The entity's red eyes glowed with a fury that made USA's blood run cold. Its form had become even more monstrous, its shadowy tendrils slithering across the ground, trying to wrap around them. Its presence was suffocating, the darkness pressing in on all sides. USA could feel the weight of the book in his hands, its pages now glowing with an ethereal light. "We need to finish this," he muttered to himself, his voice trembling as his fingers traced the strange symbols etched on the pages. A whisper in the back of his mind urged him forward, telling him to read the words aloud, to invoke the last part of the incantation. It was risky, there was no telling what would happen if he did, but USA knew it was their only chance. "USA, no!" Mira cried out, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't!" But USA didn't stop. His fingers turned the page, and the words on the next page seemed to dance, the ink swirling in front of his eyes. Without hesitation, he spoke the words aloud. The moment the last syllable left his lips, the ground shook violently, and the church's walls seemed to buckle, as if the very foundation of the village was breaking apart. A deafening roar filled the air, the sound of something ancient and powerful being unleashed. The entity shrieked again, its form flickering and writhing in agony. Its body seemed to melt into the shadows, but the red eyes remained, burning brighter and fiercer than before. It surged toward them with terrifying speed, its dark tendrils reaching out, trying to strike at them. "It's not enough," Sophie shouted, backing away in panic. "The spell, it's failing." But USA stood his ground, his eyes locked on the creature. He had one last chance, one final move to make. "We have to destroy it completely," USA said, his voice low and determined. His heart was racing, but there was no turning back now. In the center of the room, the altar began to glow with a blinding light, the symbols on the stone becoming more distinct, as if the altar itself was coming alive. USA could feel the power of the incantation building, like a storm ready to break. The entity let out a final, bone-chilling scream, its red eyes narrowing in fury. "You cannot stop me," it hissed, its voice cold and full of hatred. "I am eternal. I am the darkness that has consumed this place for centuries." But USA, with the book still in his hands, stepped forward, holding it high. The energy from the altar surged into the book, the words on the pages lighting up like fire. The ground beneath them cracked open, and the entire church seemed to tremble as though it was going to collapse. The entity screamed one final time, its form disintegrating in the blinding light. Its dark tendrils dissolved into the air, and the oppressive atmosphere that had filled the village for so long began to lift. The red glow of its eyes dimmed, and with one last agonized shriek, the entity was gone. The room fell silent. The cold air that had clung to their skin disappeared, replaced by a strange warmth that filled the space. USA dropped to his knees, the book still clutched tightly in his hands. His mind felt foggy, his body exhausted from the energy he had expended. It was over, but the aftermath was something he couldn't yet fully grasp. "Is it done?" Mira asked, her voice small, almost afraid to speak. USA looked around at his friends. They were all there, their faces pale but alive. The oppressive presence that had once filled the church was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. "I think we've done it," USA said, his voice barely above a whisper. But as they stood there, catching their breath, a strange sensation washed over them. A feeling that they were not alone. They turned toward the altar, and their hearts dropped into their stomachs. At the center of the room, where the entity had stood moments before, was a single red eye, burning in the stone. It was the same deep, glowing red that had filled the entity's eyes. "It's not over," USA whispered, his voice shaking. "This is just the beginning." The red eye blinked once, then slowly disappeared into the stone, leaving behind a crack in the altar. A crack that began to bleed dark, viscous liquid. And then, as if in response to the events unfolding, the ground shook once again, a low rumble filling the air, signaling that the cursed village, the one that had been dormant for so long, was awakening. The end of the curse. The silence in the room was suffocating. USA's hand still gripped the ancient book, his knuckles white as he stared at the crack in the altar. The blood-red liquid oozing from it seemed to pulse, as if it had a life of its own. The entire room felt alive, trembling with the weight of an ancient force awakening from a long slumber. "What is this?" Mira asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes wide with fear. USA didn't answer immediately. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the events that had unfolded. They thought they had destroyed the entity, destroyed the curse that had plagued the village for centuries. But the ominous presence that still lingered in the air told a different story. The red eye had disappeared, but its presence remained, like a specter that hovered just out of sight, watching their every move. The ground trembled again, this time more violently, as if the village itself were reacting to the disturbance. The air grew colder, and USA felt a chill crawl up his spine. "We have to leave," Zane said, his voice tense. He looked around nervously, his usual calm demeanor replaced by unease. This place isn't safe anymore. But USA wasn't sure if leaving was the right choice. The book, now glowing faintly in his hands, seemed to hum with power. He knew they hadn't finished what they started. The curse was deeper than they realized, more entrenched in the village and its history than they had thought. "We can't leave yet," USA said, his voice firm, though his heart pounded in his chest. "The curse is still here. We need to find a way to destroy it once and for all." He approached the altar, kneeling before the crack where the blood-like liquid was pooling. As he reached out to touch the altar, the ground beneath them shook again, this time with such force that USA lost his balance and fell forward, his hands slipping into the dark liquid. Immediately, the room seemed to distort, the walls warping and bending as if they were made of smoke. The light from the book flared up, casting strange shadows across the room. A low, guttural voice filled the air, an ancient, cold voice that echoed through the stone walls. "You cannot escape. You have awakened me. And now, you will be part of my eternity." The voice was not coming from the entity itself, but from the village, the very land beneath their feet. The curse was not bound to one creature. It was bound to the village, to the land itself, and the people who had once worshipped the darkness that now surrounded them. "We need to destroy the source," USA said, standing up and looking at his friends. "The village itself is the source of the curse. It's tied to the land, to everything here." They turned to leave, but as they reached the door, it slammed shut, trapping them inside. The red liquid began to seep from the walls, slowly filling the room. It was as if the village was alive, its thirst for blood never quenched. "It's coming for us," Sophie whispered, her face pale. "We won't make it out." But USA was determined. He could feel the power in the book surge once again. The symbols on the pages had begun to shift, and a strange voice echoed in his mind, urging him to finish the final incantation. It was a risk, one that could cost them everything, but it was their only chance to end the curse once and for all. "I'll do it," USA said, clutching the book tightly. "I have to finish it. If I don't, this place will never be free." The others hesitated, but they knew there was no choice. They stood by him, ready to face whatever came next. USA raised the book high, speaking the final words aloud. The room erupted in a blinding light, the walls cracking as the liquid from the altar turned to fire, burning away the darkness. The air seemed to vibrate with an unbearable intensity as the curse began to break apart, its hold on the land crumbling. The entity's voice screamed in rage, but it was too late. The final incantation had been spoken. The land began to shift, the walls of the church crumbling, the village itself disintegrating into dust. USA's vision blurred as the light consumed everything around him. He felt himself being pulled away, like being sucked into a vortex, but there was no fear. Only peace, a quiet, overwhelming peace that filled him completely. When the light faded, USA found himself standing alone in a vast, empty space. The village, the church, the entity, they were all gone. The curse had been lifted. "Is it over?" he whispered to himself. Then, as if from nowhere, his friends appeared beside him, Mira, Zane, Sophie, and Daniel. They were alive, and the weight of fear had lifted from their shoulders. "We're free," Sophie said, her voice full of relief. But USA wasn't sure if they were truly free. The village had been a prison, but the world beyond it felt uncertain. They had escaped the curse, but at what cost? As they walked together, the book still clutched in USA's hands, they looked back one final time at the empty space where the village had stood. It was gone, erased from existence. But USA knew the truth. Evil had a way of returning, of finding new places to hide. The battle was over, but the war for their souls had just begun. The end. Subscribe to my channel Night Howl. Crescent Moon.